said, what do you need an artist for? He said, artist? Your art sucks. I thought we were talking about you being a writer.
When you write a story, you're like God. You can do anything.
If you were a kid and somebody came to you and said, you know, pick 5 jobs you've ever wanted to do, this would be number 1 or number 2 sitting on top of the pile.
You rarely hear a comic writer or artist mentioned with the same awe as a film director, actor, or musician. But despite the stigma, people with incredible talent enter the field of comics every day. So what is it about this medium?
I've been in love with comics since I was about 5 or 6 years old when I first saw Adventures of Superman with George Reeves on the BBC when I was a little boy in England. And then I discovered that these adventures were actually on the printed page.
There was something in that fusion of words and images and the garish colors and the outrageous adventures that just immediately penetrated my little soul and made me go, yes, I like that, I like that. And I was pretty much obsessed with them almost immediately.
There's things you can do in comic books that you can't really do in other mediums. We can tell different length stories. We don't have to be completely linear all the time. We can tell small stories within big stories, and I just love being able to use the vehicle of superheroes to tell more human stories.
When I'm watching a TV show or a film, you know, the filmmakers set the time for me. They set the timetable. They move things along at their own clip, and it's up to me to keep up. The beauty of comics is that you control the flow of time. You control the flow of information as a reader, and you set the pace. And if you get 6, 7 pages in and you suddenly want to turn back to something, it's right there. It's all these frozen moments arranged for you, but you kind of pick the pace at which you want to be told the story.
You know, if you were a kid and somebody came to you and said, you know, pick 5 jobs you've ever wanted to do, this would be number 1 or number 2 sitting on top of the pile. So it's pretty incredible to be able to work and do something that you've always known and loved, and actually affect some level of change and direction in that industry, and it's something exciting.
The comic book industry really took off in the 1930s, started to replace pulp fiction magazines. Since then, the industry's gone through changes in technology, audience, and status.
There have been incredible changes from the time that I started in the business to what it is today. 30, 40 years ago, comic books were printed on what they called newsprint, which was actually toilet paper as far as I was concerned, because it was so absorbent, the inks just pulled right and just swept right into them. But not only was the paper cheap, the printing, it was truly a junk medium. If in registering color on a page, if you got within 1/4 of an inch of 2 colors, that was good. Today, you're getting printing that's equivalent to National Geographic. Nobody in the world in my business at that time ever dreamed that that kind of printing would take place, that kind of reproduction of paper that's being used. Comic books have been accepted today as they never had been during the time that I started. In fact, most of the guys who are in the business, both writers and artists, tried to avoid the fact, didn't let anybody know that they were doing this material because they were ashamed of it. They were literally ashamed of what they were doing.
I remember I had a conversation with Gil Kane, who I admired for years. And I said, gee, it must be great to make your living doing comic books. And Gil said, well, my boy, actually, I don't call myself a comic book artist. I call myself a line illustrator, because I really don't talk about that comic book thing. He's one of the best comic book artists in the world. He didn't want to talk about comic books.
It gives me almost a tactile satisfaction in doing this kind of work. My favorite place is sitting at the drawing board and drawing. I don't have to do it, but I want to. And I'm still lucky enough to have people, have publishers in the business who want to buy my work. How lucky can you get?
Although best known for his work on Sergeant Rock, Joe Kubert released a more personal work about World War II entitled Yosel. The book is set in the Warsaw Ghetto and tells the story of Yosel, a talented artist who was imprisoned by the Nazis. A comic book cover is like any magazine or book cover. It needs to get your attention. The cover artist's job is a high-pressure one, because whether we like it or not, many people do judge a book by its cover.
As a cover artist, my job is to scream louder than either of the comics on either side of me. If you put a Golden Age comic book on today's stands, that would stand out like a sore thumb, like it glowed in the dark. So I asked DC Comics, can I do a Golden Age cover, and we'll just have the modern Wonder Woman making an appearance on it. And, you know, I gotta say, bless them, they went for it. It's one of those rare instances where no one was looking, and I did a good job behind their back. I do feel a little bit of responsibility, especially when working with these characters that are actually older than my grandparents. But I'm also a very gentle anarchist. The minute something becomes too pompous or too full of itself, I'm ready to go in there and do something really destructive. I remember we did a cover on Wonder Woman, and she was fighting Clayface. And the editor that was in charge of Wonder Woman at the time, she liked a lot of the, what I call boxing covers. Her descriptions of, well, this issue, it's Wonder Woman versus, next issue, Wonder Woman versus somebody else. And we had a 2-issue arc with Wonder Woman versus Clayface. And I said, oh, look, I'll give you one boxing cover where it's a very proper Wonder Woman facing off against Clayface. Let me do something on the other one. And I did a cover of Wonder Woman covered head to toe in mud. Like, literally, you can't see her. And she's doing these sort of Three Stooges, you know, moment after the pie fight where you wipe your eyes clear. Somebody once told me they refer to that as the Wonder Woman versus Mexican food cover. And I mean, it's like, it's an iconic character. She is the most recognizable superheroine in the history of American comic books. And I covered her in crap for a cover just because I went, let's not get too full of ourselves, guys. It's still just comics.
Adam Hughes has made a living as an artist, specializing in covers. Hughes has drawn covers for some of DC and Marvel's biggest titles, even though he never attended art school. Jill Thompson is an artist who has worked with some of the biggest names in the comic book biz. With each new project, she has reinvented her style to match the tone of the story being told.
My work seems to change style each time that I'm working on a different project, and that's not intentional on my part by any means. I just figured out why I do that. I graduated from a school in Chicago called the American Academy of Art. You were supposed to leave with a portfolio that you could walk into any ad agency or storyboard studio in the city, and if they said, we need 3 black and white line art illustrations of these tuna fish cans for the Sunday newspaper, you'd be going, I could do that. So I didn't realize that that's what I was doing in comics. I mean, I liked comics, and I would get a story, and I would read it, and because I don't draw Wonder Woman the way I drew Seekers into the Mystery, the way I do Scary Godmother, to the way I do Sandman. The thing that has the most effect on why my art style changes for the story is the story itself, or the characters involved. I know when I write for myself, it's much more cartoony. I start out with one intention, and then it just works its way where it wants to go, and where it goes, where it gets comfortable, and then I just let the brush do whatever the heck it wants.
How did the world of comics change forever with the introduction of the Marvel method? Let's find out when we return. This guy started as an artist, but he's now one of the most prolific writers in the comic book medium. Brian Michael Bendis has written for virtually every character in the Marvel Universe, but is best known as the man behind Ultimate Spider-Man.
I was a huge comic book nerd all my life, and I just, at age 5 or 6, I decided I was going to work in comics. I decided I was a comic book artist, and that, you know, it was just a matter of time before I was doing it professionally, and there was no other goal, and everything I did in my life was aimed towards becoming a comic book artist. I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art. I made comic books that I sold independently when I worked at a comic book store, and lo and behold, I ended up being a comic book writer for a living, just to show you how completely off-center my whole entire life has been. there's no style of writing that's the right way to write. There's no way to draw or create the image that's the right way to do it. It's just this mixture of words and pictures. And there's no rules. And photography, painting, digital media, poetry, prose, all of it can be used to make a comic book. I'm a big fan of people like Matt Wagner or Howard Chaykin, where it seems like the page was too small for the ideas that he was putting in it. Like the design elements were just almost ready to burst off the page. And these things, to apply them, you just try them. You know what I mean? Sometimes you try them and go, okay, no one's ever done that before because that sucks. That's why people have tried that and it's bad. And other things you go, hey, I found a new way to do this, So I would just take these theories and elements and apply them to the page and see what worked and what didn't. And if it didn't work, you didn't get to see it. I'd hide it away. And it's funny that like the minute I stopped drawing all day, money and awards, and it was just my whole career changed. So yeah, it was odd, but that kind of, I don't know. It's funny, like a lot of people who are genuinely, big readers of mine don't know I can draw. So it's, what are you gonna do? Boo-hoo.
Frank Miller's cover of the first issue of his Batman masterpiece, The Dark Knight Returns, immediately lets us know that he's tapped directly into the psyche of the Bat. Spartan and fearsome, Batman's coiled silhouette almost appears to ride the lightning, hurtling toward his unseen target below. There are artists and there are writers. The workload of each job can be daunting. Matt Wagner has taken on both roles for mainstream comic companies, as well as for his own projects.
I'm kind of unique in certain ways in the comic book field in that comic books tend to be a production of a team, usually a writer and an artist. I do both. And additionally, I often write for other artists. I've written a lot for other artists. There are basically two different styles of writing in comic books. One's called a full script, which looks very much like a movie screenplay. It will describe how many panels are on the page. It'll often describe how those panels ought to be laid out. And it will have every description of what happens. It will have all the captions already written, all the dialogue balloons already in place. I write plot and dialogue fashion. That means that I write a more generalized plot. Break it down page by page, but I will just describe what happens on that page. I won't tell the artist how many panels it should be. I won't tell them how to lay it out. Occasionally I'll throw in a kind of ripe chunk of dialogue here or there to nail down a moment and get across the atmosphere of what's happening. But I certainly don't write it all out in advance. Then the artist draws it based upon my descriptions. It comes back to me, and then I add the dialogue and the captions after it's drawn. And for me, this makes the process far more collaborative. It gives the artist a chance to have some say in how the story's gonna unfold. And as a result, sometimes art will come back to me and it will suggest all sorts of things to me that I wasn't thinking when I first laid down the storyline and the action and the plot of the story and the characters. Just seeing a character drawn into a concrete form, what used to be an abstract thought, will often suggest personality quirks that will just creep up from seeing the visuals made concrete now. For me, it's a far more exciting way to work.
Marvel Comics created amazing characters that seem to have more depth and humanity. Marvel not only revolutionized the stories that were told, but the way in which comic books told them.
The so-called Marvel method was caused by an emergency. I had too many stories to write. So let's say I was writing a story for Jack Kirby, and John Romita needed one. But I couldn't give it to John because I hadn't finished Jack's yet, but I couldn't let John stand around doing nothing because he was a freelancer, and if he was drawing nothing, he wasn't making any money, and I couldn't do that to poor John. So I would say, look, John, here is the idea for the story I want you to do. I don't have time to write it. This is what I want the story to be, though. This is the villain. This is what ought to happen. Now, you go ahead and draw it. Draw it any way you want. I'll put the words in later.
That turned the medium into what it was supposed to have been since 1938, which was a visual medium. Before that, it was a script medium. And scripts used to, I remember I worked on the script system for 15 years, and it actually narrowed the scope of my possibilities. So we were doing a 20-page silent story with our characters. With Stan's approach constantly in our ears that the characters must overact. In other words, like it was the silent screen version of acting.
As they finished the artwork and brought it to me, it only took me a day or less to put in all the dialogue. And in that way, they were contributing to the story as much as I was, but by putting in the dialogue and making the people talk the way I wanted them to talk, I was keeping the flavor of the characters the way I wanted them. And it worked out beautifully. It can only work when you have an artist who is also great at story. And luckily, all of our artists were.
There are few people who affect an entire industry as much as these two gentlemen. Their names are Jack and Stan. Enough said. This is essential reading from some of the greatest comic book creators. Here's Comics 101. Sergio Aragonés is a legend in the industry. His ability to capture humor in comics has won him awards in North America and around the world. His most notable works are his contributions to Mad Magazine and a title of his own creation, Gru the Wanderer. Alex Ross completely revolutionized the look of comic books. His artwork for Marvel's and Kingdom Come took the comics industry by storm. His lifelike paintings almost make you believe a man can fly. Will Eisner. A full documentary wouldn't be enough to list his contributions to the world of sequential art, but his works, The Spirit and A Contract with God, are among his most significant. Will Eisner is the man for whom the Eisners, the Academy Awards of Comics, are named. If you don't know him, you should. Even if you've never read a comic book in your life, you know Stan Lee.
Stan Lee had been working in comics since the early 1940s, and about 20 years of it, he kind of got sick of it, as the legend goes, and went to his wife one night and said, I'm gonna quit. This is 1960. There's a whole new decade ahead of us. There's a whole new half of the century ahead of us. I want to do something different with my life. And Stan's wife said, well, before you quit, why don't you just do what you want to do?
So I thought if we could get characters who, besides their super life, if they had a real personal life, like Peter Parker, Spider-Man. He didn't have much money. He was pretty good in school, but he never had enough time to study. He lived with his aunt, and he was always worried about her because she was ill. In other words, I try to make him somebody that a reader could relate to.
We used to call the old days of comics, comic superheroes, the Great Scott period, because that was all they ever said was, Great Scott. What Stan did was not say Great Scott. He said, oh my God, what am I gonna do tonight? I gotta study, I got a girlfriend waiting for me.
Literally from Fantastic Four on, it was boom, 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 boom. Everything hit, everything was perfect, everything nailed it, and it wasn't just one or two things. It was like literally dozens and dozens of characters. Even the idea of the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and the Hulk and Spider-Man and their villains and their supporting cast were all home runs. And even Stan had, at the same time, embraced the audience, and he almost built the first fan club. There's almost like a standoffish. He didn't know who any of the people who made the comic books were. Stan was like, here's Jack, and here's Steve, and here's the Merry Marching Marvel Society. Be part of our fan club. Stan talked to you in the comics. His voice was there with Enough Said and True Believer.
And welcome to the Marvel age of comics. Make mine Marvel. And see, I always loved advertising. I love finding a way to make people notice something. When you write a story, you're like God. You can do anything. You kill somebody, you have somebody fall in love, you have somebody fall out of love, you bring the person back to life, you trick the reader, it's just a lot of fun.
His work has affected the industry in ways that, well, why don't I just let the industry speak for itself on this one?
I was grounded in Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby.
I'm a big Kirby fan.
There's only Jack Kirby.
There is something about Jack Kirby work that is energizing in a way beyond merely good drawing. Jack's belief was that comics were not necessarily things on 32-page newsprint paper. He believed comics was a way of thinking, a way of approaching a story.
Don't do anything mildly. Do everything in extremes. If you're going to shout, shout so your tonsils show. If you're going to bang something, bang it hard. That stuck in my mind, and it started to bleed into everybody else. Jack Kirby was the guy who started that.
Jack was the first comic book artist really to draw comic book pages that differed from newspaper strip pages. His characters were not confined to these little tiny panels. They didn't fit in those little tiny panels, and they sprawled across the pages. It's not surprising to me that Jack did the first full-page panels and the first double-page spreads. If they'd let him, he would have drawn the comics bigger on giant, big poster boards. He liked big pictures. He liked things that got in your face, and you couldn't not pay attention to them. That's why his characters are always leaping out at you, and there's this strange forced perspective he invented that makes the panel just jump out into your face sometimes.
Extreme foreshortening and extreme dynamics was one of Jack Kirby's trademarks in his illustrations, especially with the finger sort of coming out towards you. And things like the way that characters would leap almost off the page were some of Jack Kirby's pivotal moments. I mean, and those are stereotypes now all over the place. But when you first saw them in the early ages of comic books, they were crazy. Nobody was drawing like that. He had these ideas of layout and of comic pages that nobody else was doing at the time.
I would take him an idea, and I'd show him this idea I had for a new comic or a new character, something like that, and he'd go, "This is great," because he did that about everything. You could show Jack the worst drawing, the worst idea in the world, and he'd say this is great because it was great to him that you created something. And then he would start giving you ideas, and have you ever thought of doing this with it? And he would somehow take my idea and make it sound like something. He would add on to it, and I would sit there going, "Oh yeah, that's right, that's a good idea." And I'd scribble down notes and things like that, or just try to remember the things he was saying. And I'd go, "Wait a minute, he's been looking at this thing for a minute and a half. Where did all those ideas come from?" And yet they were Jack. That was what he was about.
You look at Fantastic Four, Thor. Every issue he was creating something new, and that's within one series. And at the same time, they're creating like 5 or 6 different series. I just don't know how you can have that fertile an imagination. And of course, with Jack, how you're able to put that much physically on paper. We'll never see anybody like that again.
You felt more like a writer around the guy, because he treated everybody like they were an equal. And we weren't all equals. None of us were his equals.
The people who created these larger-than-life characters often became legends themselves. The art of creating comic books has been accepted as exactly that, art. When the industry began, who could have guessed these characters would live, quite possibly, forever?
There's things you can do in comic books that you can't really do in other mediums. We can tell different length stories. We don't have to be completely linear all the time. We can tell small stories within big stories, and I just love being able to use the vehicle of superheroes to tell more human stories.
When I'm watching a TV show or a film, the filmmakers set the time for me. They set the timetable. They move things along at their own clip, and it's up to me to keep up. The beauty of comics is that you control the flow of time. You control the flow of information as a reader, and you set the pace. And if you get 6, 7 pages in and you suddenly want to turn back to something, it's right there. It's all these frozen moments arranged for you, but you kind of pick the pace at which you want to be told the story.
If you were...
But not only was the paper cheap, the printing, it was truly a junk medium. If in registering color on a page, if you got within 1/4 of an inch of two colors, that was good. Today, you're getting printing that's equivalent to National Geographic. Nobody in the world in my business at that time ever dreamed that that kind of printing would take place, that kind of reproduction of paper that's being used. Comic books have been accepted today as they never had been during the time that I started. In fact, most of the guys who are in the business, both writers and artists, tried to avoid the fact, didn't let anybody know that they were doing this material because they were ashamed of it. They were literally ashamed of what they were doing.
I remember I had a conversation with
mentioned with the same awe as a film director, actor, or musician. But despite the stigma, people with incredible talent enter the field of comics every day. So what is it about this medium?
I've been in love with comics since I was about 5 or 6 years old when I first saw Adventures of Superman with George Reeves on the BBC when I was a little boy in England. And then I discovered that these adventures were actually on the printed page.
There was something in that fusion of words and images and the garish colors and the outrageous adventures that just immediately penetrated my little soul and made me go, yes, I like that, I like that. And I was pretty much obsessed with them almost immediately.
I said, what do you need an artist for? He said, artist? Your art sucks. I thought we were talking about you being a writer.
When you write a story, you're like God. You can do anything.
If you were a kid and somebody came to you and said, pick 5 jobs you've ever wanted to do, this would be number 1 or number 2 sitting on top of the pile.
You rarely hear a comic writer or artist.
A kid and somebody came to you and said, pick 5 jobs you've ever wanted to do, this would be number 1 or number 2 sitting on top of the pile. So it's pretty incredible to be able to work and do something that you've always known and loved and actually affect some level of change and direction in that industry, and it's something exciting.
The comic book industry really took off in the 1930s, started to replace pulp fiction magazines. Since then, the industry's gone through changes in technology, audience, and status.
There have been incredible changes from the time that I started in the business to what it is today. 30, 40 years ago, comic books were printed on what they called newsprint, which was actually toilet paper as far as I was concerned, because it was so absorbent, the inks just pulled right and just swept right into them.